You're listening to 90.3 WHPC, the voice of Nassau Community College in Garden City, New York. I'm Bill McIntyre here with Jon Gallo for another edition of this week's Long Island News, the news show that brings you news stories about Long Island and about Long Islanders.
Good to see you, Bill. I know you had a little bit of a holiday vacation there. Hope yours was good. Hope, you had enough turkey or whatever you wanted to eat. Yeah. Maybe tofurkey, whatever your preference.
Eating I can do.
Cooking, that's another story, but at least you help clean. But nonetheless, we're here with a great guest that we always appreciate having on.
Yes.
Yancey Roy from Newsday, their political bureau reporter. Chief, actually, over up in the Albany Bureau. So we're happy to have him on here to discuss some of the fallout, I guess, of the end of the last cycle as we go into a new calendar year, focused on a new legislative session and the race for governor and many other kind of races that kind of come underneath it along the way. So thank you, Yancey. Appreciate your time. Thanks for being with us.
Good to be here. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Good to see you, Yancey. John and I were just talking about the field for the race for governor, and I said, well, maybe it'll get chiseled down, and there'll be a couple of candidates. He said it may expand
before it gets smaller.
So everybody seems to be jumping on the bandwagon now for wants to be the governor of I don't know who would want to be the governor of New York. I always ask that question.
A lot on the plate, of course.
It's a sanity check.
But
it's like, who wants this job?
That said, you certainly know. Yeah, but you know the individuals quite well from covering them over the years and different capacities. The ones who want that job and are vying for it, including, of course, the now sitting interim governor, Kathy Hochul, the first female governor in New York State history, who's now going to be running as the incumbent. Obviously, there's the Attorney General, Letitia James, who's entered the race. There's two Long Island Congress members, one running as the Republican, one now as the Democrat, also entering as in the race, and some other folks part of the field. So just let listeners know kind of where things stand and your kind of take of what folks are seeing going into, again, the end of this year into next year.
Sure. We've had the most movement on the Democratic side. The Republican side hasn't changed that much. Just to mention the folks that are running: Lee Zeldin on the Republican side, Lee Zeldin, the congressman from Suffolk County; Rob Astorino, the former Westchester County executive; Andrew Giuliani, son of Rudy Giuliani, and a few others. That hasn't changed now for months. What we've seen in the last few weeks, all in November, is action on the Democratic side with Letitia James, New York public advocate Jumaane Williams, and Long Island Congressman Tom Suozzi jumping into the Democratic primary against Kathy Hochul. And folks still wondering if New York Mayor Bill de Blasio will jump in. He's certainly weighed a run for it, and folks around him are talking openly about it. And so he might jump in. I think there's a couple of things that are going on. Why are people jumping in now? And what the calendar brings to this is a couple of things. One is there's a different calendar for the primary, the state conventions, and all of that than there used to be in New York.
Yep.
Primaries would be in June. That was to accommodate some voting rights issues and court issues with regards to absentee ballots and military personnel overseas. But basically, the primary got moved from September to June. So that sort of triggers a whole array of changes. The conventions will have to be somewhere probably near the end of February. They haven't changed them yet.
Okay.
Haven't set them yet, rather. And then you have to have a petition period for people to try to get on the ballot. So now everything's moved up. The conventions used to be in May. Now they're in February. So if they're in February, I think that's why you're seeing people announce candidacies in November, because you've got to get rocking. You got to get your staff. You got to raise money.
Yep.
And speaking of raising money, we're also in this critical period right now. From November to January 15th is the next mandated day that a candidate has to report his or her fundraising totals.
Okay.
And right now you're seeing all these candidates in sort of a money chase from Thanksgiving on to January to raise as much money as possible to make a strong splash in January and show that you're a viable candidate. And if you don't do so well, then I think, some people are going to try to maybe talk you out of running, depending on what you show in January. So I think there's a real emphasis right now on candidates trying to get endorsements and also money to be able to look strong come January.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And certainly, like you said, with the compressed kind of calendar and schedule, a lot of things kind of are going to happen fast here once we come into the new calendar year. But that said, let's stay at the top right now with Kathy Hochul, because her as the incumbent, that has sometimes a lot of kind of liabilities, but it also has some, we'll say, perks in the sense of, she's in the public eye. She has all these different, whether they be bill signing events or ribbon cuttings or whatever they may be, that maybe some of the other candidates might not get the press on. So I guess you want to talk about how that kind of plays, and also I guess just like I said, the history made by her and the high favorables, how like she's kind of seeing that gives her, I guess, a pretty clear path as she tells the donors.
I wouldn't say clear path, but she's got the head start in the lead.
No, that's what I mean. But I'm sure she's telling donors, that she has a very viable path, rather.
Yep. Look, she had a lot of advantages. One is she got to announce right in August, the day one she took office after Andrew Cuomo, that she was running. That allows her to get a jump on opponents. That allows her to really crank up the fundraising machine. She says that she's already raised $10 million. It might be $15 million by the time they have to report in January. That's a huge head start over everybody else. The closest one to it is Tom Suozzi says he has about 3 million right now. The other advantages of being in the governor's office are just one, appearance and stature. I mean, people get used to being Governor Hochul, and it sort of gets ingrained to voters. You're the incumbent, and that helps. The other thing we saw just a few days ago, which helps, by the way, kind of flew under the radar for kind of general news consumption, but Governor Hochul announced a contract with 1199, the huge healthcare workers who works in hospitals and other healthcare settings. And they're also one of the most well-funded and most powerful unions in the state. Tish James has been someone who is probably counting on union support as we go forward. But the fact that a governor can sit there and reach a contract, which has raises for your members, can carry a lot of sway with rank and file voters. And the other advantage of being a governor is you've got state budget coming up in January, and that's going to be a process that rolls all the way to April 1. And a lot of interested parties, unions and others, will want something in the budget. And as a governor, you get to negotiate those and make a lot of friends that way and inroads with people by being the one who negotiates. And that's something that Hochul has that the others just won't be able to utilize at all. So there are a lot of advantages to being the incumbent.
Yeah, that is definitely going to be, I think, clear as we move forward. Like I said, the session, the first session that she's going to oversee, and the first budget, that will be passed under her administration, certainly will be very interesting to see what comes from it. And the session starts, I believe, January 5th, if I'm not mistaken. And I know it's a little bit compressed. I
think so. I haven't looked at I know the calendar is out now. It's usually, a few days after the first.
Yeah, I think they go up for one day and then they kind of come back and then start a full week and go forward, I guess, into June, I believe. But okay, so that makes sense in terms of where, she kind of, like I said, is telling her donors why she, should have the money spent on her and why folks should be endorsing her, including Long Islanders, which is another story maybe we'll kind of mention along the way here. But going to maybe who is seen as maybe her primary challenger, kind of being the Attorney General, Letitia James, having a very high public profile, of course, and a compelling kind of professional history as the AG, the New York City Public Advocate, council member, and so forth. So can you talk a little bit more again about her, kind of positioning and, her role even with the investigating the Cuomo administration, how that plays into her candidacy?
Yeah, well, she is got several things that she will be trying to use in terms of building a following. One would be the historic nature of her candidacy, which would be a bid to become the first African-American woman governor of any state in the United States. Yep. She also comes from the more liberal wing of the party, long ties way back with the Working Families Party and unions. So as you look at the four declared candidates right now, in a sort of a broad generalization, you've got Tish James and Jumaane Williams sort of on the more liberal progressive side, and you've got Kathy Hochul and Tom Suozzi on the more moderate Democrat side. Yeah. And as far as like the Cuomo investigation, that's going to be interesting to see what kind of effect that it has in the race. On the one hand, people who are not fans of the governor, and there were a lot of those in the Democratic Party,
of course,
will certainly appreciate that Tish James was the person who took him on and whose report led to his resignation. Now, there's also going to be people in the party who liked Cuomo.
Yep.
Still like Cuomo. He liked his policies, even if they don't agree with the behavior, and they don't want the state going, in their view, too far left. So who are those voters going to go to? Well, Tom Suozzi definitely wants to make an appeal to those guys. He thinks he's the moderate who can be, he hasn't said this, but in a way he's going so directly, but in a way he's really is kind of going for the sort of Cuomo voters from the past. And he's taken some steps towards that. He's associated himself with Byron Brown, the Buffalo mayor who faced a progressive socialist challenger out in Buffalo. He is associated also with Eric Adams, the mayor-elect of New York City. And then you also have Hochul, who began her career as a more moderate to conservative Democrat, and since she became lieutenant governor, certainly moved farther and farther to the left. So she's kind of somewhere in between Suozzi and James on that spectrum. And so the key is going to be who can peel off a big enough block of support.
Of course, yeah. And to that point, I know I saw, was it Attorney General Tish James, last night, but then I saw also Congressman Tom Suozzi on Errol Lewis's show on New York One the other evening. And basically, yeah, he was very much walking that fine line of saying, there are plenty of things he disagreed with Cuomo in his management style, but, kind of definitely giving an open kind of arm to those voters, it sounded like, at the same time, especially being also an Italian-American, from the downstate area. But that said, in terms of the Attorney General and her profile, besides being involved in the investigation of a powerful New Yorker being Andrew Cuomo, the former governor, I know another issue that Bill and I have been talking about for a long time is her investigations into the previous Trump administration and also obviously the Trump organization as a whole. So can you talk about how that plays too, and is still ongoing, I guess, and plays into the campaigns?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Look, in a Democratic primary, you're not going to have many voters who are fans of Trump, not at all, frankly. So I wonder if playing the card up of I'm the one who took on Trump will have a bigger factor in a primary as it would in a general election. I'm thinking that once you get past the Democratic primary and now you're facing a Republican opponent, and Lee Zeldin of Suffolk County is considered the front runner on the GOP side right now. And he's been one of, when Trump was in office, he was one of Trump's strongest allies in all of New York State. So if, for example, as we play this out, Zeldin, say, wins the nomination, I got to imagine whether it's Tish James or anybody else on the Democratic side, you're going to see them try to tag Zeldin with Trump and use that issue because Democrats know that Trump is not overall very popular at all in New York State. So I don't know. It's an interest. Tish James will certainly play it up because as Attorney General, she's brought a number of cases. The lawsuit that eventually resulted in the dissolution of the Trump organization because of fraudulent practices she was in office when that happened. So she has that to her credit. I just don't know if that will be a big enough issue within a group of Democrats who are all very critical of Trump.
That's a very, I think, good point. Maybe it might impact more the national donor base, kind of having the profile.
True enough.
But like you said, I think, it's pretty blanket across the board for the most part, except for some of the Democrats who've been disillusioned and maybe, vote in the generals differently. Like you said, probably won't see it as that much of an accomplishment because, they see it that way. But that said, You're right. The donor base is also another question. Will that, use that up in pitches to donors and see if that can build up your campaign chest? I mean, look, her last reported amount in the summer was just $1.6 million. Talking about Tish James here, which is very small compared to Kathy Hochul. Now she's in the race and she's been fundraising more come November. But I think all of the candidates are going to have less than Hochul when we get to January. It just depends on how much less. Yeah. And
for Letitia James, though, I don't know. It's just a knee-jerk reaction from me is that she's doing a good job as Attorney General, and people may want her to stay there as Attorney General. rather than see her, go to the governorship.
Well, speaking of that, you're talking about a Long Island audience here.
Exactly.
There's a couple of guys who want her to stay, and that's Jay Jacobs, who is not only the Nassau County Democratic chairman, but the state Democratic chairman, and Richie Schaefer, the Suffolk County chairman. They are among those, and there are others in the state who would like to see a unified, not fractured Democratic ticket where everyone gets behind Kathy Hochul for governor. Tish James changes her mind and goes back to run for re-election as AG. Tom Suozzi changes his mind and goes back to run for Congress. I don't know if I'd want to put odds on that happening, though, because although they would like that, here's the thing. The chance to run for governor doesn't come along very often in New York State. We're not a term limit state. And look how long the last few folks have lasted. Now, we'll throw out Spitzer Patterson for a second, but you had Cuomo elected 3 terms. You had Pataki elected 3 terms. You had Mario Cuomo elected 3 terms. So if you're an aspiring politician and you've always wanted to be governor and you think it's the job for you, it's hard to pass up a run for it when Kathy Hochul is an incumbent, but she's only been on the job a few months, so it's not like a regular incumbent.
Exactly.
Because if you pass it up, history would say you've got to wait, 8 more years or something before you can run again, and that's a lot of time.
It certainly is. It certainly is. Let's remind our listeners that they are listening to this week's Long Island News here on 90.3 WHPC, the radio voice of Nassau Community College, with Bill McIntyre, myself, Jon Gallo, and thankfully still joined here by Newsday's Yancey Roy, the Albany bureau chief up there, telling us about kind of where this race stands and what we can somewhat start to expect going forward. And you did hit on, like you said, one of those other folks, and the next segue was to Congressman Suozzi, who, like Bill kind of alluded to with the AG, and you just stated, some people are saying, hey, the Congress, is up for grabs potentially, especially with what redistricting may look like. The idea of staying in that seat, the party might want, but we've talked to Congressman Suozzi, and he's been pretty candid, about him, kind of selling himself as this pragmatic where primaries are won by bases. And, he sees it as, maybe the wall is kind of closing in on him in a sense in his own district. That's maybe my take. But point being is, he is declared, he is already somewhat criticizing the Hochul administration for their COVID plan. I know you wrote an article about that, and, was in part of a sit down, I believe, with the congressional delegation statewide, at least the Democratic side, about the infrastructure plan. So can you talk about, kind of his announcement and how, again, he may shake up the water and, like you said, it plays into the whole kind of field?
Well, he formally announced on Monday, and just right after began to take a shot at Kathy Hochul on COVID response. And what's sort of notable about that is Hochul took office in August under extraordinary circumstances, as we all recall, with Cuomo resigning. And until about this week, rivals for the job had been kind of muted, hadn't said much about Kathy Hochul. I mean, I think there was like this period when the state was in an extraordinary situation. Nobody was very critical. They wanted her to get up and running and make sure the state ran smoothly. But now, here we are just after Thanksgiving, and I think what we're seeing is the first time that rivals are taking big shots at Hochul, because right after Suozzi did, the next day, Letitia James also took shots at Hochul about COVID. She was saying that there should be a statewide mask mandate. So I think apart from the specific issues of management of COVID, I think the sort of campaign themes, it signaled that, okay, now we're into a campaign, and now, the gloves are starting to come off. Nothing too harsh just yet, but now is coming the time where the rivals are there. They're going to sort of second guess and pick at policies to try to distinguish themselves and knock down some holes in the armor, if you will, of Kathy Hochul, who right now is enjoying pretty good ratings in the polls. But it kind of signals that the campaign is on.
Yeah, that definitely seems to be true. Maybe the holiday season, so maybe not all the knives are out yet, but looks like we're trending in that direction, like I said, as the winter continues. But in terms of, besides that, I guess, like I said, trying to split that moderate lane and targeting kind of suburban, I guess, voters in a lot of ways. I know, that's kind of, I think, his play. But But I guess if you want to talk about that, or maybe just in sense of, that's kind of his district, even how that plays into filling his seat, which, like we said, is going to be open. I know there's talk about, one of his primary opponents from last time, I believe, Diageo. There's a state senator, Garin, is being, I guess, talked about. There was Santos on the Republican side, who challenged him last time and got relatively close, and another couple of names. So can you talk about, maybe those folks potentially and how that all plays?
Yeah, it's really early, obviously. Folks, Squazzy had been openly weighing this run, so I think nobody was caught off guard. But it's still so some names have emerged, but there's still time for more. We've seen on the Democratic side, as we said, Jim Gorin, state senator from Northport, Melanie DeRigo, who ran in the primary against Swazi before. Joff Lafison, Nassau County legislator. Yep. On the Republican side, George Santos ran before. He's expressed interest. A couple other names popped up. Vincent DeMarco, a former Suffolk County sheriff. Andrew Rea, former assemblyman from Suffolk County. But here's the thing. It's very early, and there's a big factor here, and that is redistricting.
Yeah, undoubtedly.
All of the congressional lines, as well as all of the state legislative districts, have to be redrawn before the 2022 election. When does that happen? This is all in a very compressed calendar. I think what's likely to happen is there are some proposed maps out there, but frankly, you can just throw those out the window. I think that anything realistic will come out probably towards the end of January. From the legislature, most likely, and that's when you'll see some maps. And so that's when more of the candidates will probably crystallize. Well, they're going to have screenings before January, I think. Maybe they'll wait till early January. You might hear some more names come up, but it's really going to take hold once you kind of figure out the lines and where the lines are going to be, which is probably January, which is why it's still a little early to try to handicap the field for who runs for Swazi's seat, right?
Yeah, because you may be in the district now, but when redistricting comes, you may not even be living in the same district. So
that and you might look at the district now, and there's a certain Republican Democrat breakdown. I had the number memorized, and I can't remember. I want to say it's about 58,000 more Democrats than Republicans in the district. But maybe after they draw the lines, it's 75,000 advantage to the Democrats, and maybe someone on the Democratic side says, "Hey, that looks pretty good. Maybe I'll do that." Or maybe because they have to shuffle and protect other incumbents, maybe the advantage is down to 35,000, and you decide it looks kind of risky, and maybe I won't jump in.
Yeah, and the demographic plays. I know that's something that I know the assembly members, other folks are facing too. I think one member just jumped into the attorney general race. I believe Clyde Vannell from downstate, and the nature of him talking about his district where he represented a lot of Queens. He was likely to represent more of Long Island. So maybe some people say my voting base, like you said, isn't here, even if I'm still in the district. So, what are my prospects really? But okay, so that's a lot. And obviously, Congressman Swazi certainly is, trying to make a very legitimate run here and, try to be in it to the end to win it. But also there's the process. I was talking with Bill. I know Letitia James has kind of boosted up George Latimer, the Westchester County executive, and people might be jockeying a little bit for, LT Gov picks, with, I guess, Hochul going with Brian Benjamin, the former state senator. So that's certainly something as well that I know will be considered. But I guess, in a little bit of time we have here left with you, Yancey, just I guess in terms of others, maybe, whether it be the field, I guess, in the governor's race or, the Republican side of it, where does the LI delegation kind of stand? Do we see endorsements coming out yet, or is everyone still kind of holding their cards at this point?
By and large, people holding their cards at this point. I mean, we should mention that, there's been a few names floated for Letitia James, a possible lieutenant governor running mate. George Latimer, the Westchester County executive, he's endorsed her. There's another people floating the idea of Steve Ballone, the Suffolk County executive, as another.
Who hasn't entered the race yet, and I wonder how the Tom Swazi decision might play into that also.
Right. It's an interesting calculation. I don't know. I don't know that selection of a lieutenant governor candidate will do much to attract voters or a lot of, moderately interested voters to your campaign. Nobody tends to say, oh, yeah, I'm going to vote for Bill McIntyre because Jon Gallo is his lieutenant governor candidate. But I tell you what it does. What it does if, say, for the sake of argument here, Tish James says, George Latimer is my running mate. George Latimer is the county executive. George Latimer has a political operation. George Latimer would have a get out the vote operation that could help her in Westchester County and maybe even Long Island. And so more practically speaking, what picking someone like a county executive brings to you on the ticket is some sort of operation to bring out the vote and help get supporters to the polls. That
makes a lot of sense. Kind of like on the national level, why VP picks are a lot of times from those swing states, because like you said, they have the connections, they have the field operations and kind of mechanics from the party there behind them. So, okay, that makes sense. I guess in terms of, and maybe just to touch again, I know you did mention Lee Zeldin, who again still seems to be the Republican front runner. Does it seem that any of those other names, I know Andrew Giuliani, like you said, Raul Astorino, most of the county kind of party folks and bosses have gone, it seems like, with Zeldin. Does anyone seemingly have that path forward? At least,
Well, Zeldin's the front runner for sure, and he does have the most endorsements, and he does have the state leadership behind his back. I wouldn't necessarily reach a conclusion just yet or say that it's sealed up. I mean, I've been around long enough to remember, like Bill Weld, when Bill Weld was the former Massachusetts governor and came to New York, and he was going to run for the Republican nomination, and he had the state party apparatus behind him. And lo and behold, he didn't get the nomination. John Faso was able to wrangle that nomination from him. But when there's been other examples on the Republican side of a candidate having the backing of state leadership, but not getting the nomination. But there's a caveat to that, which is when those things have happened, it's generally because state leadership has been behind a more moderate Democrat and the rank and file members rallied behind a more conservative. And certainly in this field right now, Zeldin is the most conservative out there. And Astorino, the former Westchester County executive who ran in 2014, his argument has been somewhat that I'm the most electable Republican. I'm the guy who can win some moderate votes because I've done it in Westchester, and Lee Zeldin can't do that.
Yeah, I mean, I know Lee Zeldin was kind of in one of these viral videos, I believe with, was it Congresswoman Boebert, who I guess made some comments that were very inflammatory, to say the least, about one of her other colleagues. And I believe he was in the background of that video. So certainly, like you said, he has a brand. And, I think, like you said, it may be that the base wants, the more conservative elements. So, even if other people are in there, maybe it doesn't make a difference. But that's a very interesting point, like you said, in terms of how it can and has played out in other circumstances. Just the last thing here, Yancey, in terms of the impact of the last election cycle where this red wave, kind of happened. How does that play, obviously, into the candidates' kind of decision-making, especially around the important Island issues, whether they be property taxes, things like bail reform, PSEG and LIPA, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, I think the Republicans think they have a winning formula that they found in 21, which is to really hit they always hit the Democrats on taxes, but also crime and bail reform, the laws that were passed by the Democratic controlled legislature in Albany. They felt that they used that effectively against everybody that was running on the Democratic side, whether it was Todd Kaminsky or Laura Corn or Tim Sini. And I think that you'll see a lot of that on the Republican side, no matter what, going forward. Look, a wild card perhaps in campaign themes for next year is what is the Supreme Court going to do regards to the abortion law? They just had the arguments in a case about whether to uphold a Mississippi law. Does the Supreme Court action one way or another impact elections in New York and other states? I think that's also going to be a little bit of a wild card in how national themes will impact on local elections.
Yeah, that's definitely, I think, a good takeaway from this. I know people are talking about the New York State Reproductive Act and how that might play with what might be the fallout of the Supreme Court's decision ultimately kind of federally, but we will certainly stay tuned, and we will be watching all your reporting and your colleagues, of course, in Newsday across the board, especially as the Albany Bureau gets more and more busy up there and gets more filled with reporters running on caffeine, I'm sure, late into the night. So very good, Yancey. Thank you so much for your time. We definitely wish you and your family a good rest of the year and happy holidays, and look forward to speaking with you in the next year, of course.
You too, guys. Thanks for having me.
You're listening to 90.3 WHPC, the voice of Nassau Community College in Garden City, New York. I'm Bill McIntyre, here with Jon Gallo, and now we're introducing Thomas Maier from Newsday, who's written quite a few articles, but the
very compelling one most recently about organ transplant rates being severely impacted by COVID. It was a very kind of expansive expose, so we're happy to have him here to talk about kind of the ramifications of what he found, essentially. So thanks, Thomas, for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it. No,
most definitely. It's a very important issue, of course. We all think about COVID and how it's had so many kind of cascading effects, of all types of public health matters, whether they be mental health, opioid crisis, et cetera, et cetera. But certainly for folks who are already in dire health straits, like those on the waiting list for organs, it was really an intense situation. So can you tell our listeners, what you kind of found? I know there was a lot of compelling kind of firsthand reporting there.
Well, as you point out, arguably the transplant community, people that are waiting for kidneys, livers, hearts, lungs, mainly kidneys. Kidneys are about 90% of the transplant community. They were arguably the most vulnerable community when COVID hit the New York area. And during the months of late March through May of last year, most of the hospitals in the New York area shut down their transplant programs on the overall rationale that the hospitals were being flooded by incoming COVID patients. Some of the transplant programs, those facilities were actually used to treat COVID patients. And of course, that was a great emergency. But if you've been waiting patiently for months, sometimes years, for a transplant, and your magic moment comes for a transplant, and then that's pushed off, that can have very dire consequences. And what we found is that there were some people who died because of it, other people who had their health impacted. And so we took an examination back a year ago at the outset, those first 2 months, and tried to put faces on the story, if you will, the people that died, the people that had their health severely impacted, and some of the really miraculous cases that happened in which by doctors and hospitals working together, they were able to save lives.
Yeah, no, it really was amazing.
Well, when you say that, kidneys are the majority, that means that these people, as they're waiting for this, for their replacement organ, they're either on dialysis, and it can be up to 3 times a week.
During the pandemic, where it's even more difficult, I'm sure, to get the services.
God, I can't imagine.
Exactly. If you or have a loved one or friend, if you're aware of the dialysis world, you realize, as you say, that how tethered people are to their dialysis just to maintain their health and their lives. These are kidney patients looking for a donor, and often sometimes there are kidneys that become available from cadavers, dead donors. But then there are people who are live donors, and those are usually the preferable donors, but those are relatively precious and rare, and generally speaking. And so people wait for a long period of time for a kidney in particular. And when COVID came along, it really put the kibosh on everything, if you will.
Yeah. And to that point, as your reporting found that basically, like you said, at the height of the pandemic, the system for transplants basically shut down in the state for about 2 months. And, my question is, in terms of the COVID regulations regarding the donors and the transplants, of course, people were already immunocompromised. There was this new novel global pandemic. I get the idea of erring on the side of caution, but how has that kind of evolved, we'll say, from the beginning when I'm sure it was, very restrictive and, I'm sure there were extra precautions. Has it been the same since then, or have things opened up in terms of, testing of folks? And, how is that process, Thomas?
Yeah, you're right. There has been an evolution. There was arguably, I guess there are some people who would suggest that the transplant community was put at the back of the line, if you will, when COVID hit. And in some places, it was perceived as almost like elective surgery. I think when COVID first hit, there was the concern that some of the donors may have the virus. They weren't sure how much they would be able to use any of the donors. In fact, there was a study that was done that found that there were some organs that had to be discarded because of concerns that they might be infected with COVID.
Yeah.
Over time, they have learned to first be much more careful about the transmission of the disease. And so by about May of last year, the transplants began to be renewed, and there were, by the end of the year of last year, transplants were basically at the same rate as they had been prior to COVID. But for that time period, it was very severe, and they've learned a lot since then. They're still learning a lot. And in fact, in some places around the country where there has been, unfortunately, still a great degree of hospitalization of COVID, you see reports of kidneys and livers and other type of transplants being postponed. So we have learned some things about the impact of COVID on the transplant community, but nevertheless, they still are very much impacted by this disease.
Yeah, no, definitely would. Definitely can't be overstated. In terms of another aspect, that seems to play into it was vaccine eligibility for folks who were immunocompromised in terms of transplant recipients and patients. Can you talk about how that kind of played into this process?
Yeah, it was very dramatic. In fact, one of the people that we feature in our print and video, bear in mind, we did a big print story it's on Newsday.com, but we also did a documentary with it.
Yeah.
And one of the people that we focused on was an administrator at Hofstra whose job was to deal with student affairs and had a lot of contact with students. Well, he was waiting for a kidney that was postponed because of COVID. And then in the process of putting this all together, he found out he was in a study at Johns Hopkins about the vaccines that were then being tested. And he was very surprised to find out that the vaccines were not as effective for himself and other people that were taking anti-rejection medicine for transplants, and the anti-rejection medicine seems to blunt the effect of the vaccines, and so I remember very distinctly when he emailed me, and we had yet to appear in the paper. We were still putting the documentary together. And having already interviewed him, and then just to find that out, almost like living through this whole process with him, how surprised he was to be part of a study, and then to find out that the vaccines that were so effective, 90% effective for the general population, were somewhere, I think, around 30 or 40%, but effective for people like himself, transplant recipients. So. The transplant community has had a number of different factors that they have faced during this crisis that goes well beyond the risk that the general population, which has already had a great risk from COVID. So you could make the argument that the transplant community was the most vulnerable population of all during this COVID crisis.
Yeah, it just seems to me so archaic, kind of the way we do this. I need a kidney, so I got to go find somebody who's got one that I won't reject. And with all of the medical breakthroughs that we've had, I mean, I've heard, I don't know any scientists who work on it, but I've heard they grow livers. They can,
in petri dish, there's early testing, and
they can grow organs, which wipes out the whole rejection thing. Because if I take a cell from you and I grow an organ and give it back to you, your body's going to think it was yours. There's not a problem. Right. It would just circumvent so many, not to mention, it would help people stay alive. It just seems like we're playing with such old rules, I guess.
Yeah, well, there's science has been extraordinary. Actually, science has really shown its strength and its ingenuity during this crisis by coming up with a vaccine the way it has in such record time.
Right.
And hopefully down the road, there may be ways in which livers and kidneys may be able to be replicated. But for right now, it's still a relatively, and for the foreseeable future, it's still it's a long process for people. And my heart really goes out to those people who are in dialysis.
Yeah. Oh, man.
In fact, my neighbors across the street, without speaking, too much out of turn here. Mm-hmm. One of them died from COVID, and her husband was on dialysis. He was going back and forth.
Christ.
They feel that it wasn't from. They feel it wasn't from the exposure from dialysis. But when you know people like your neighbors who are involved in the dialysis world, you just realize how much they are tethered to that system. And just how vulnerable they are.
It's not enough of a word to say that they're impacted by that, because their life begins to revolve around it.
Yeah.
That becomes everything.
This is homeostasis.
You can't go away. You can't go to a wedding. You can't do, your whole life has to be, and if you don't do that, you're not going to stay alive. That's
it's a big, business around the New York metropolitan areas. There's a lot of dialysis centers and such. And, we looked at primarily the transplant community and such. But, I know for a fact that the dialysis community was also pretty severely impacted by COVID.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Particularly in the early days when there was still, if you remember at the very beginning, there was a debate about even wearing masks, and very responsible leaders in the scientific community were still not certain it was even necessary to wear masks. So during that month of March and early April, the virus just went through places like the proverbial hot knife through butter. And, very, very dramatic.
Of course. And let's remind our listeners, they are listening to this week's Long Island News here on 90.3 WHPC with Bill McIntyre, myself, Jon Gallo, and thankfully still joined here by Newsday reporter Thomas Maier, who's talking about, a very important expose, a multimedia piece, along with the story that Newsday has put out. And we certainly urge everyone to go find themselves. And as another good reason to subscribe to Newsday as well, of course, as always. But that said, and we'll get into that data point, I think that needs to be talked about in a second. But, we're talking about folks, and the perception might be, older individuals who need these organs. But as your story, clearly laid out, you're talking about this Queensborough community college student that, this really runs the gamut. This is from, young children to, older individuals, of course, everyone in between. So, it definitely was very compelling. And could you just talk again about just that human element of hopefully what these stories can provide to the public to see the importance of this public issue?
Yeah, as you mentioned, there was a young woman about 20 years of age who we highlighted in the story. She was going to college. She was part of a kind of like a hip hop dance group as well. Very active. Loved that. And she came down with an autoimmune disease that somehow impacted her liver. And it was one of those situations that she had to have a liver transplant immediately. And if she didn't, she would die. And yet this happened right at the beginning of COVID. So her family, she passed out essentially, and her family rushed her to Northwell, to LIJ North Shore. And the head of transplant there, who we interviewed, tells the remarkable story of late at night, this young woman comes in. They realize if she doesn't get this transplant, she's going to die. And the only place that was open at that stage of the game was Mount Sinai. And what happened at Mount Sinai in Manhattan was the head of transplant there was able to negotiate with the hospital that there was a part of that hospital that had been, it was in the process of being rehabilitated or whatever. To make a long story short, they were able to move things over to that section of Mount Sinai. So in the middle of the night, they took this young woman, almost dead from liver disease, and brought her in the middle of the night from Long Island to Manhattan. And quite miraculously, they were able to find another liver that was from a donor in the New England area, and they were able to save her life.
Thank
and
God.
We interviewed her probably, I guess, about 6 months after all of this. And yet, particularly when she showed us the scar on her chest, which is really extraordinary. Mm-hmm. Something like a liver transplant is still a very technically sophisticated thing. And she's just very lucky to be alive. And she was one of the more miraculous, heartwarming stories in our series.
Yeah, I think so. And like I said, I think just putting, the name and the face and making these data points humanized, I think is one of the challenges that I hear from advocates in a lot of different spaces, but especially when it comes to health matters, this, urgent by definition. So, going to some of the data, I know we were talking about April and May, at the peak again. It seemed that New York State had only transplanted about 8 organs donated by living individuals compared to about 113 that was reported in the same months back in 2019. So how has that kind of developed now? Are we seeing a kind of rebound? Are we seeing, that kind of tick back up to where it should be, or where does that stand?
Yeah, we have seen a rebound, thank heavens. Yeah. And I think some of the initial great caution that was taken, where it led to a whole shutdown of the system for about 2 months in late March through early mid-May of last year. I think they've learned a lot of lessons from that, particularly about trying to do things safely and about the viability of donors and such. And so they do a lot of testing prior to transplant operations, testing for COVID, that is. And they've learned a lot. And so the system has rebounded from it. But it has, this story that played out in New York has been played out in other portions of the country right now. In fact, the last 3 or 4 months, we've seen a number of stories about delayed transplants for kidneys and livers at different sections of the country because of COVID. So I think I'd like to think that Newsday was way ahead of the curve on this by really pointing this out. And this is one of those stories that when there's a tremendous event like the influx of COVID cases that we saw last year, there are people who get lost, if you will, in that tidal wave. And certainly the transplant community was one of those people who were almost put at the back of the line, if you will. And I think that the role of a newspaper, certainly a place like Newsday, what we try to do is come back sometimes and look at things and say, hey, look what happened here. And arguably, these folks were the most vulnerable community. And I think subsequently, there's been some medical ethics concerns about whether or not, if people are the most vulnerable, where should they rank in terms of the response by hospitals? So I think there's been a lot of debate since this occurrence last year.
Yeah, and I think, like you said, this is what good journalism does. It not just chases the headline when it's top and pressing and in the moment, but kind of gets to do this. Let's take a deeper step back, like you said, and let's see what this really means in a larger context, and how we can hopefully have policymakers, have folks who are in points of decision making that can make this a better situation for these people who are in such dire health straits. Definitely, if that is a positive outcome, whether it be that or things like, housing discrimination, like the Ally Divided series, this is certainly, I think, what everyone can appreciate is, important, necessary journalism. So hopefully they support it as such. Maybe just in the last question that I have in terms of the story is, what are advocates saying, or folks, even just firsthand, maybe not the advocates, but the people who got these transplants or are still in need, on terms of making it better than it was before, like Bill said, not just kind of going back to, okay, well, maybe we get 113 by living individuals in the same month, but driving up, donor kind of registry, other things like that. I know people talk about opt-in, opt-out systems. I think like some are done in the UK and across the world. Just maybe if you've heard anything in terms of what people recommend, maybe even the ones who dealt with it themselves, to be changed, to be different, if anything.
Well, last year, they saw overall the living donors for transplants drop precipitously. I think it was the lowest rate in 20 years. The transplant community makes a big effort to try to encourage donations. And I think everybody who's listening to this, hopefully if they read the story or just listen to our conversation today, if they're so inclined, they really should think about becoming a donor. It is the gift of life. In fact, that's the name of our story. It's called The Gift Interrupted. And I think it is a tremendous gift that somebody can give to another human being if you can donate an organ. And so I think the community, the transplant community, has been making that effort for many, many years. Yeah. But I think COVID really put a fine point on just the need for donations, the need for people recognizing just how many thousands of people just in our Long Island, New York area are in need of an organ, and to support those systems and those organizations that promote transplant and organ donation.
There you go. Yeah. Amen.
Yeah, I think that would be big. It's one thing to hear a statistic about how many people might need. It's another thing to see their faces and hear their stories. And their lives revolve around waiting for this organ, or whatever it is, a kidney or a liver. My cynicism goes up, though, when I think of the idea that dialysis is a big business, a real big business. And if there were anything coming along in breakthroughs, essentially that would torpedo that business, I can see the breakthroughs not happening.
Yeah, there's always going to be elements that benefit from things as they operate, and hopefully they would either adapt to.
That would change. That would change the whole landscape, the structure and the landscape of medical care as far as donation and receiving organs.
Like you were saying too, knowing that biopharmaceutical companies are trying to work on these types of like bio 3D technologies and all these other things, I would like to think that
they are growing livers.
Although we have a tendency to look for the points of concern and potential justified cynicism.
Well, I like to put it under the microscope and see what exactly is going on here.
There's always things to be considered. But that said,
I became an organ donor, but I'm not a hero because it's after I'm dead.
But it makes the difference.
I see these people that do this, and they're alive and they're willing to go into a hospital and
they don't know the person,
cut open and get a piece of their liver taken out and give that to somebody. I'm not that. After I die in my car accident, whatever it is that happens, that, and so, and people would say to me, "Oh, you became a donor," and I'm like, "Yeah, well, I'm not going to be there. I really don't see how that's going to." Although I am curious about how that will impact any of my relatives who, after my death, Is the guy in the hoodie with the sickle? Is he going to come in and scoop my body up, and and they're not going to know what happened to me? Or
I don't think we need all of that, but in terms of just the stigma that there is out there, that has always been an uphill battle for folks in this space.
Oh my God,
religious and ethical kind of considerations that advocates I know at Donate, NY and Live On and or rather other types of organizations, the Life Donate Life Registry and stuff like that are trying to push back against. But
I think you're right. If it doesn't affect us, we really it becomes something that's just not on our radar. So the story is a great thing in that sense, that people begin to understand that people live with this.
Yeah.
Well, that's what we were hoping with this story. This story actually grew out of, I work on the investigative team at Newsday, and this actually grew out of an academic study. We just happened to see it. We've been following the academic studies about COVID, and this caught our eye, and we pursued it. But when you go out there and actually try to talk to people, and you get a sense of their lives, and in the case of those people that have died, of course, this transplant community, they're particularly vulnerable to getting COVID. Yeah. So we had some people that had terrific and miraculous almost transplants arrangements during this crisis, but there were a number of people whose lives were unfortunately taken at much greater rates than the general public. And so we featured some of those folks in our story as well. We talked to their survivors and their families. So, I just think what this did was underline the need for donations, for people to think about this community, and for the medical community to keep in mind this community, and in terms of judging in future, if there, hopefully there aren't future COVID crises and such, but presumably if there are, that there's more discussion about who are the most vulnerable people, and
definitely,
and how should they be served. And so I think this story hopefully will add to that debate.
Definitely it will. And I think, it's essential to realize, like you were saying, it's easier and easier to become a donor, an organ donor, whether it's on the DMV forms you fill out, whether you're even at the post office now, you're changing your voter registration. Yep. I know that's one thing advocates have done to try to put it on as many forms, basically statewide or whatever municipality as possible. So consider giving the gift of life, as was mentioned, by the name of this story here, because it may make an immense difference, kind of incalculable to one person at least. So,
and you can catch that story on Newsday.com, right? You
of course.
Yes, and, it's called The Gift.
The Gift
Interrupted. There you go. So do that, look at that, and definitely subscribe to Newsday as always, so you get great reporting.
Yeah, we want to thank you, Tom. Really want to thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your invitation.
Likewise, have a great rest of your year and holidays, and we look forward to talking to you again sometime soon.
Definitely.
Same here. Thank you so much.
Take care. Be well. Okay, Bill, there was certainly a lot of great information that we had today. Yancey Roy always is an amazing guest to tell us, kind of what some of the tea leaves and what he's hearing, on the ground in terms of what will impact the future governance of our state. But also we had there Thomas Maier, who spoke a lot about health issues, which brings me to specifically the new health commissioner that Kathy Hochul did just appoint and announced yesterday at a press event. This is Mary Bassett. She was the former New York City Health Department chief. She had left not under the best terms. There was some kind of situation that arose, but nonetheless, she would take the helms from the former Commissioner Zucker, who left after the administration with him kind of was, taken out of office in a sense. So that's something that's important to keep an eye on, especially with everything going on with COVID. I know that this Omicron variant people are talking about has had one case in Long Island, a couple in the city and around. So keep an eye on that. And just the last thing is the police reform package that Steve Ballone has announced. We'll try to do a deep dive into that. I know there's a lot of information coming out. Main thing, body cameras, some other kind of agreements, but obviously that's a longer conversation for another day. So
yeah, that's a whole show.
Yeah, as usual.
Anyway, the clock on the wall says it's time for this week's Long Island News to move on out of here. We thank you for joining us and remind you can catch this week's Long Island News every Friday at 3 p.m. right here on 90.3 WHPC.